Please join me in welcoming Professor Schmidt-Nowara.
Great. Well, thank you, Jasmine and Lauren, for organizing this event. And thanks also to Stephanie Stepanek for keeping me in the loop about this wonderful exhibit and also lecture series. I'm really delighted to be here. So I just want to say, make a couple of introductory remarks referring to the handout that you have and also to this first slide because they capture the images that I've included. I've tried to capture the tensions at work in Spain in the 19th century by juxtaposing these images. Because what I'm trying to show is that they illustrate the tension between historical legacies of absolutist rule, an economy based on privilege and status, administrative fragmentation among the different kingdoms and principalities of the Iberian Peninsula, versus modernizing efforts to create liberal political and economic systems based on free labor, free markets, contracts, rule of law, a representative government of the sovereign people, and national and indeed imperial integration, as well as the separation of church and state. So these are many of the ambitions that are at the forefront of Spanish politics and ideas in the 19th century, but they're often existing in tension and open conflict with these historical forces associated with aspects of the monarchy and the church in Spain and feudalism as well. So for example, in this image, these two images here on this first slide, you see this portrait of Godoy by Goya. Godoy was called the Prince of Peace. That was one of the titles he was given by King Charles IV. He was essentially the prime minister of King Charles IV through the 1790s and up until 1808 when the French invaded and overthrew the Spanish monarchy. And Godoy is a good example of monarchical power, non-representative government, the sort of capriciousness that many Spaniards felt was typical of this style of governance. But at the same time, just a few years later, you see this newspaper called El Vapor, Steam, which is from Barcelona, which is one of the most economically dynamic cities and regions of the Iberian Peninsula in the late 18th and through the 19th centuries. And there we see really the stirrings of Spain's Industrial Revolution from a fairly early date. So even though we still see these very strong images of monarchy, the church, feudalism, superstition, I mean, these are all themes that Goya explored at length in many of his paintings and drawings. At the same time, Spain is a country which is modernizing, perhaps more slowly than countries like England or France or Germany after unification, but nonetheless, many of the hallmarks of modernity are also characteristic of Spain in the period that we're going to talk about. Same with these images on the handout. The first one is of course one of the statues, one of the many statues of Columbus that was raised in Spain and also its colonies over the course of the 19th century, harkening back to the glorious period of overseas expansion, conquest, and colonization. So very much a reminder of a glorious past. But simultaneous with this celebration of Columbus and the distant past is also again, in the case of Catalonia, but not just in Catalonia, in other parts of Spain as well, this is taking place at the same time as the construction of the national railway network, and efforts to create a modern, globalized economy. So those are some of the tensions that you should keep in mind as I'm going through these various historical periods in the 19th century, and also to keep in mind that these tensions are never resolved. Not in the 19th century, not in the 20th, and not in the 21st either. I mean, some of them are, certainly. Spain is now a place that has freedom of religion and separation of church and state, but the question, for instance, of national unification, which is a key one over the course of the 19th century, is back at the forefront of Spanish politics with a vengeance since the economic crisis of 2007, 2008. So the outline, I've sort of divided up the 19th century into three very broad sections, as you can see here. The first third, from 1808 to 1833, would be characterized by foreign invasion, warfare, not only within Spain itself, but also within its vast overseas empire in the Americas. A fluctuation between constitutional and absolutist governments, which would not be resolved until later in the 1830s. The second period, the age of Isabella II and the Democratic Revolution, is a period that sees the consolidation of constitutional monarchy as Spain's form of government, and that is the form of government that it has to this very day. But it is one still a period of intense political contestation about what sort of constitutional monarchy would it be. Would it be democratic? Would it be based on oligarchy? These issues were very much up for play in the mid-19th century. It's also, however, a period of very marked economic growth and modernization as well in all sectors of the economy. And then finally, we'll talk about the Restoration, which refers to the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, which had been temporarily overthrown in the person of Alfonso XII from the last quarter of the 19th century. And this is a period of relative political stability in Spain, of great cultural flourishing, of significant economic growth as well. But it ends up as a period of really profound crisis because of the Spanish-American War of 1898. And Spain's long run as an imperial power comes to an end very suddenly and very dramatically with profound consequences. And we'll spend a good bit of time talking about that. Now that I look at the outline again, you'll notice among some of the recommended readings that I've included, not only historical works, but also a number of novels from the period that we're studying. And actually, all three of these novels that I've listed, La Regenta by Clarín, The House of Ulloa by Emilia Pardo Bazán, and Fortunada and Jacinta by Benito Pérez Galdós, these were all written during the Restoration. It's really a period in which Spanish letters and arts are coming into their own in Spain. And all of these books are easily available in libraries in English translations. Why don't we start with Ferdinand VII. So Ferdinand, of course, was the son of King Charles IV, and as such, spent much of his youth as the Prince of Asturias, that is to say, the crown prince of Spain, the heir to the throne. And Ferdinand actually had staged a palace coup against his father in 1808, in which his father had to abdicate his throne, and Ferdinand was acclaimed as the King of Spain. But this palace coup was very short-lived because Spain at the time found itself in a very dangerous alliance with Napoleonic France. It had been forced into this alliance through military defeat against the French Republic in the 1790s. It's a very unfavorable peace in which Spain had to supply subsidies, troops, all sorts of material to the French in their efforts to secure dominance in Europe. And this palace coup, Napoleon Bonaparte, who had since become the Emperor of France, he found this somewhat unsettling. So to resolve what he thought of as political instability and unreliability in Spain, he invited Ferdinand and Charles to a meeting in Bayonne on the Spanish-French border and took them both prisoner, deposed them, kept them in captivity for the duration of the French occupation of the Iberian Peninsula, and put his own brother, Joseph I, on the throne of Spain. So Joseph Bonaparte became José I, the King of Spain. Now, the French had been doing this, of course, over the course of the French Revolution, is redrawing states, creating client states. Once Napoleon came to power, placing either relatives or his most successful generals on newly created thrones in places like Italy and other conquered territories in Western Europe. What was different about Spain, however, is that it never really submitted fully to Napoleonic dominance. And the French occupation, which Goya painted and sketched at length, was met by immediate resistance in the royal capital, in Madrid, the uprising of the 2nd of May in 1808, when the people of Madrid took up arms against the French army in a very short-lived rebellion, which the French very brutally repressed the next day, the 3rd of May, 1808. Now, I'll return to these paintings in a moment, because they're not really contemporary to the scenes that they're depicting. They're actually, in some sense, historical paintings, and that's significant. So anyway, the uprising in Madrid, nonetheless, what it did was it stirred up a peninsula-wide resistance to the Napoleonic occupation. Guerrilla warfare popped up in regions like the Basque Country. Let's go back to that map. So in these northern territories in particular, the Basque region, Navarre, and these other Basque provinces, Álava, would be a site of guerrilla warfare. But there were guerrilla bands really active throughout the peninsula during the French occupation. There was also an effort to form a government of resistance in the absence of Ferdinand and Charles and their captivity in France, which was gathered here at Cádiz, a southern city in Andalusia, which was one of the few parts of the country which had not fallen to French arms and which was protected by the British Royal Navy against a French invasion. And there what happened was that the resistors to Napoleonic rule drafted Spain's first constitution, the Constitution of Cádiz, which was ratified in 1812. This is a fairly remarkable document because the effort was not only to institute active citizenship, representative government, a monarchy controlled by a constitution, not only in the peninsula, but also in Spain's enormous overseas empire. Right, so I've got a map here of Spain's empire at the time of the French occupation, right? And you can see that this enormous American empire in particular, concentrated in North and South America, but also in the Caribbean as well, and also on the other side of the world, in the Philippines too. So the ambition of the Constitution of Cádiz of 1812 was to incorporate the colonies and colonial subjects into essentially a global Spanish nation ruled over by a constitutional monarch. And of course, the would-be king of this regime would be Ferdinand VII himself, who was known in his absence as El Deseado, the desired one, but not for long. So when the French are finally defeated, to a certain degree by Spanish arms, guerrilla warfare is very important, but principally by the British army that's organized by Wellington, first in Portugal and then active in Spain itself, drives the French from the Iberian Peninsula at the end of 1813. And in 1814, Ferdinand returns to the peninsula. No one quite knows what to expect, but he decides, after sounding out various notables and generals in the Spanish army, he decides to stage a coup and abolishes the Constitution of Cadiz in 1814 and restores absolutist rule. So that means abolishing the Legislative Assembly, all the other provisions of the Constitution, restoring the Inquisition, for example, which had been abolished by the Cortes of Cadiz, the parliament gathered at Cadiz, and so on. So it's an effort to really turn back the clock in many ways to a Spain before the Napoleonic invasion. This, of course, turns out to be impossible. Let's go back to these Goya paintings for a moment of the 2nd and 3rd of May. So I think what's interesting about them as historical paintings is that they're helping to create the myth of universal Spanish opposition to the French occupation, right? So the idea that Ferdinand and subsequent governments as well would try to promote was that the Spanish as a whole had come together as a people to oppose the French and to expel them from Spanish territory. And these sorts of images of resistance and of repression as well are meant to promote that idea. However, that's historically simply not the case, because there was very widespread collaboration with the French during the occupation. There is very bitter resistance. There's absolutely no doubt about that. That's very important. But there is also collaboration, and you might say that the number one collaborator was Ferdinand VII himself, actually, right? He had willingly submitted to his captivity and was absent from the peninsula during the entirety of the French occupation. But the idea that he and his governments tried to promote after the abolition of the Constitution of Cadiz and the restoration of absolutist rule is that he and all Spaniards had been enemies of the French from the first moment. Now, it's also important to remember that the restoration that Fernando attempts to undertake is taking place in a country that is politically now divided, and would become even more so during his rule, but which is also physically ravaged by the long years of occupation and resistance to the occupation. I just want to read you a couple of descriptions written by a contemporary a few years after Ferdinand's restoration. This is a very interesting source. This is the travel diary of a New Englander, actually, George Ticknor, who was Harvard's first professor of Spanish literature in the early 19th century. And so to perfect his mastery of Spanish, to buy books for Harvard Library and for his own collection, he sojourned in Spain for much of the year 1818 and wrote a travel diary, which is available at the special collections of the Dartmouth Library. And there are a lot of very interesting descriptions of the physical traces of the war against the French. So, for example, when traveling through La Mancha on his way to Andalusia, he says, "In the course of the day, I passed several villages destroyed by the French, and in one found a commissary sent by the king to make an estimate of the damages, repairs, and so on, who gave me a satisfactory account of it. It was Villearta, a little village of 450 inhabitants situated in an open plain without the least means of defense, which yet cut off and destroyed in the course of a year and a half, as appears by authentic documents, above 3,200 French troops, until at last in 1810 it was utterly destroyed in revenge and remains still a mere heap of ruins with hardly 120 inhabitants. And this was actually a typical French counterinsurgency tactic, not only in Spain, but also actually Napoleon himself had perfected this tactic in Italy in the 1790s, which was to literally level villages that were suspected of resistance to French rule. Similarly, Tickner describes Girona. Let me just show you Girona on the map. That's near Barcelona, a very beautiful city in Catalonia, just a little bit to the north of Barcelona, and the site of a siege by the French army. And he says, Tickner says, Girona's most interesting point to me, however, is the awful resistance it made to the French in 1808, its final surrender, its generous rebellion in 1809, and the horrors of the siege that followed when, after being blockaded 8 months and remaining starved 2 more, it hardly yielded to 3 divisions of the French army. It is the first time I have been on a genuine field of Spanish heroism. And when I looked about me here, I saw the cathedral pierced with bombs and still bearing marks of having been fortified, and whole streets more or less marked by the desolation of war. So this is a physically ravaged country upon which Ferdinand is attempting to restore his absolutist regime. This is an interesting image, of course, from Goya. This is in the exhibit here at the MFA, actually, the Diversiones de España. He did a whole series of prints of bullfighting and scenes associated with the toros. And what's interesting is that the French had actually, under Joseph I, Napoleon's brother, they had actually abolished the corrida, as it was called, the bullfight, as an effort to modernize Spanish customs and habits. But Ferdinand, as a way of establishing himself again as absolute ruler in Spain, reintroduces the bullfight. And what's quite interesting is that it clearly becomes it's a mass spectacle meant to appease the masses, but which is also a theater for forms of political criticism and dissent. And this is something that the New Englander Tickner picked up on and described very well in his visit to Madrid in 1818. He spends quite a lot of time at the bullfights and described them at length. So I'm going to read one of his descriptions, which I think is very good about sort of the political purpose of the bullfights, but also the bullfight as a window into the political tensions that were just under the surface of Ferdinand's restored monarchy. So Tickner writes, "There is the animation of the crowd divided into parties that take sides with the bulls according to the provinces from which they come, and continually excited and exciting continually, passing from one strong emotion to another, now murmuring at a picador because his blow was not well struck, now crying out to have fire put upon the bull's back to exasperate his failing rage, and now waving their hats and handkerchiefs and fans and shouting bravo, till the heavens seem to echo it again because, goaded to desperation, the favorite animal has left his eighth horse dead in the arena. Setting aside the cruelty of all this, shutting your eyes upon the horrors of the fight, and recollecting and seeing only the immense population so gracefully arranged around the amphitheater and continually bursting forth with such varied and passionate feeling, I know not where else I could go to see a spectacle so exciting, so splendid, and so magnificent. It is a curious and interesting sight to see the people when, from their union in a great mass, they feel their own strength, and when from their excitement they enter into the rights of their own importance and power, when in fact they feel themselves to be what they are, and become for the moment free in consequence of it. Royalty is little respected on Mondays in Madrid, and therefore whatever the people persist in acquiring in the amphitheater, even to the extreme cruelty of putting fire upon the bull's back to goad his fury, is always granted to avoid unpleasant consequences. So I think that's an extremely acute observation on Ticknor's part, because I think what he's picking up on is that the spirit of rebellion was just under the surface of this restored monarchy of Ferdinand VII. And I'll return to that question in a moment. The Inquisition, just wanted to mention that briefly. This is a somewhat anachronistic image. This is actually a late 15th century painting by the Spanish artist Berruguete. But the Inquisition, this is an aspect of Spanish life that foreigners always wrote about. Ticknor writes about the Inquisition in his diary at great length. Partly because Ferdinand had restored it when he returns to the country in 1814. It's in a much weakened condition from its origins in the late 15th century, but nonetheless, it's still a potent arm of not just ecclesiastical, but also of royal power during the Restoration. And it would not finally be abolished until 1834. So this sort of spirit of rebelliousness, of revolution that Ticknor picks up on, the way in which it was most commonly manifested during the era of Goya and Ferdinand VII, and really up until the later 19th century, even into the 20th century, was through what's known as the Pronunciamiento. The pronouncement would be a very gross translation. And the idea is that a pronouncement is made by a military commander in association with a clique of civilian politicians. They denounce the standing government and ask the rest of the army to rise up with them to overthrow the ruler and to institute a new regime. This is a constant feature of Spanish politics from the period of Ferdinand VII well up and particularly through the 1870s. But as I say, it even has a 20th century manifestation because Francisco Franco, at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, he began it with a pronunciamiento, precisely. But the origins of the pronunciamiento are in this period that we are discussing right now, partly because the generals had assumed such a prominent role in Spanish politics in the early 19th century, because they had been at the forefront of the resistance to the French, and so they felt as though they were the most effective defenders of national integrity and national sovereignty as well. So this image right here, this is actually a historical painting from the 1880s. That's I think it's hanging now in the Prado. If you've been to the Prado recently, or you're planning to go sometime in the near future, one of the wonderful things about it, the expansion of its gallery space, is that they've been able to bring out of storage this huge collection of 19th century historical paintings that they have that were hidden away for decades, but now you can really see many of them depicting these pivotal moments in Spanish history. And the one that's being depicted here by the artist Gisbert is of a pronunciamiento led by a Spanish general named Torrijos. This one is actually from I think 1830, 1831, sometime around there, in southern Spain. As you can see, it failed, right? Torrijos and his supporters are about to be executed. But some of the pronunciamientos, although many of them failed, many of them were also successful. And that's what I want to turn to now, is the first really successful one of 1820, which was led by a general named Riego, R-I-E-G-O. Riego. who staged a pronunciamiento in the southern city of Cádiz in 1820. And in his pronunciamiento, what he declared for was the restoration of the Constitution of 1812. Right? So he's not trying to overthrow the monarchy altogether, but he's trying to restore the constitutional monarchy that Ferdinand himself had suppressed in 1814. And Riego, who is at the front of a large contingent of troops who are based in Cádiz, is ultimately successful in forcing Ferdinand to accept and to swear loyalty to the Constitution of 1812, which was restored. So this is a period in Spanish history that's known as the Liberal Triennium, which I think you'll find there on your handout, from 1820 to 1823. The Constitution is restored. And this is a period of really bitter political contestation on the left and the right. The left, the defenders of the Constitution, feel very insecure because they know that Ferdinand really does not want to accept the Constitution and will take the first opportunity to overthrow it. There are also guerrilla bands that take to the field in parts of Spain in resistance to the Constitution. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And also, and this is a situation that Spain would find itself again in the 1930s, is that internationally, the situation was extremely unfavorable for a constitutional revolution. The British, who would be the nominal ideological allies of Spanish liberals, were uninterested in fighting another war in Spain. And the French were particularly hostile to a constitutional regime because they had their own restored absolutist government, right? After the overthrow of Napoleon in 1815, the Bourbon monarchy of France had been restored. And so that Bourbon monarchy is quite hostile to the Spanish constitutional regime that takes power again in 1820. And in fact, in alliance with other conservative governments, right? This is the age of Metternich. It's an extremely conservative period in European history. The French lead a very large-scale invasion of Spain in 1823, which overthrows the Constitution and restores Ferdinand to absolute power for another decade. Now, what's interesting also about Riego's Pronunciamiento of 1820, it's significant because it's the first successful pronunciamiento in Spanish politics that leads to the restoration of the Constitution, but it also has an interesting imperial dimension to it because Riego happened to find himself at the head of so many troops in Cádiz because these were thousands of Spanish soldiers who were embarking on ships that were going to take them across the Atlantic Ocean to Buenos Aires, where they were going to help to quell the revolutions in Spanish America against Spanish rule, right? So this is a very complicated history, so I'm going to just try to gloss over it somewhat quickly. But one of the unintended consequences of the French invasion of Spain in 1808 and the overthrow of Ferdinand VII and Charles IV and the putting of a Bonaparte upon the throne of Spain was that the colonies in the Americas took this essentially as an opportunity to assert their desires for independence. Right? So the crisis of the Spanish monarchy in Europe opens up a crisis in the Spanish colonies themselves, right? Led by figures such as Simón Bolívar in Venezuela. Now, what happens then is that over the next, practically the next 15 to 20 years, there are very bitter civil wars in places like Mexico, Venezuela, Gran Colombia, other regions of Spanish America, around the question of independence or loyalty to Spain. And Ferdinand really sort of exacerbates the situation because when he returns to Spain in 1814, rather than trying to negotiate some sort of compromise with independence forces in the colonies, he sends out a huge expeditionary force which tries to crush the rebellions in present-day Venezuela and Colombia, and which is temporarily successful, but is really fighting an uphill battle because of the tremendous distances between Spain and the Americas, and also the very shaky economic and political situation of Ferdinand's monarchy. So Riego and his men who are gathered in Cadiz are part of this effort to crush the rebellions in Spanish America. But they know how terrible insurgency and counterinsurgency is in the colonial situation, right? If they are prisoners of war, they might be summarily executed. In the Caribbean region in particular, they're susceptible to diseases like malaria and yellow fever, which take a high toll. So they know that in some sense, being sent to fight in South America is a death sentence for them. So then rather than allowing themselves to be sent to the Americas, they rise with Riego against Ferdinand's absolutism and restore the 1812 Constitution. It also means they don't have to go to the Americas to fight these horrible wars. And essentially, the failure of that expeditionary force sets the stage for the final emancipation of the vast majority of the Spanish colonies, all the way from present-day California down to the Tierra del Fuego. Now, that's not quite the whole story when it comes to the colonial empire. The reason being that Spain still maintains an extremely rich colony in the Caribbean, Cuba. And the reason why Cuba and Puerto Rico remain loyal to Spain when the other colonies are fighting for their independence is that these are two islands that are undergoing plantation revolutions. So very similar to what was happening in the deep south of the United States in the first half of the 19th century was taking place in those places as well. Cuba in particular became the world's biggest producer of cane sugar, and almost 800,000 African slaves were carried to the island between 1780 and 1867 when the slave trade was finally abolished. Right, this is a map of the major embarkation and disembarkation points of the transatlantic slave trade. And Cuba was by far the biggest slave colony in the history of Spanish America. And it's very important for the Spanish government and for the Spanish economy in the 19th century as well. It's a source of great wealth for Spanish investors who are, trafficking in slaves, starting up sugar plantations, trading in slaves, banking in the island. It's an important source of revenue for the Spanish treasury. The island is extremely prosperous and sends huge remittances back to the government every year. It's also a very important site of economic modernization for Spain because there are a number of Spanish immigrants who traveled to the colony over the course of the 19th century, and they send their remittances back to Spain as well. And economic historians have shown that those remittances are one of the fundamental elements of investment in industry, agricultural improvement, urban construction over the course of the 19th century. So, in a sense, the Spanish-American Revolution, Spanish-American independence, is somewhat of a disaster, obviously for Spain and for Ferdinand VII, but it's mitigated to a certain degree by the profound transformation that's taking place in Cuba in the 19th century. And we'll, of course, return to Cuba in a moment. So let's turn to the period after Ferdinand's death, right? So Ferdinand had restored absolutist governance in 1823 after the French invasion, ruled with an iron hand for much of the next decade until he died in 1833. And when he dies, His heir is his infant daughter, Isabella II, who was born in 1830. Now, what's interesting is that there was some division among Spanish leaders about whether Isabella could inherit the throne or not. Because typically the Bourbons and Ferdinand the Spanish monarchs are a branch of the Bourbon family. The Bourbons had prohibited female heirs to the throne. But Charles IV, Ferdinand's father, had suppressed that rule in the late 18th century, setting the stage for a queen of Spain as opposed to a king of Spain. Now, why this became controversial with the death of Ferdinand is that his younger brother, Don Carlos, was aspiring to inherit the throne with his brother's death. And so, in the last few years of Ferdinand's life, divisions were taking shape within the Spanish court, within the Spanish military, around the peninsula, among supporters of Isabella's claim, who tended to be liberal, and supporters of constitutional government, and supporters of Don Carlos, who tended to be reactionary, and supporters of absolutist monarchy. And there are very important divergences in these two positions. A centralized versus a decentralized state, the question of church-state relations, because Carlos and his supporters were very much in favor of keeping the Inquisition and the predominance of the church in intellectual and political life. And also very profound questions about property rights as well. Would feudalism remain intact, or would there be a transition towards a market society, which is what the liberal supporters of Isabella wanted to put in place. So with Ferdinand's death and Isabella's elevation to the throne under the regency of her mother, Maria Cristina, war breaks out again in Spain, what's known as the Carlist War, in reference to Don Carlos. And this is the most famous general of the Carlist cause, Tomás de Zumalacárregui, a Basque, wearing the red boina, the red beret, which is the hallmark of the Carlists throughout their history. Because the Carlists never really went away. In fact, they were one of the most effective fighting forces for Franco during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. But in the 1830s is when they take shape. Let me go back to the map. And where they're most effectively entrenched is in the north, right? A scene of resistance to Napoleon and his forces in Navarre, Álava, and these other Basque provinces here. And for a variety of reasons. These are economically prosperous peasant societies whose communal forms of property will be broken up by the liberal reforms that Isabella's supporters want to introduce. They want to introduce a stricter form of private property as the foundation of the Spanish economy. They're highly Catholic and live in close relationship to their priests. So they see the liberals around Isabella as a threat to the church and to their religion. And also the Basque regions had always enjoyed extreme autonomy from the monarchy in Madrid. They enjoyed special privileges, which are called fueros, F-U-E-R-O-S, fueros, which were privileges that exempted the regions from paying taxes, from certain kinds of military service. So this is a region that had always enjoyed significant autonomy from Madrid and which wanted to maintain that autonomy and was afraid that if the liberals around Isabella restored the Constitution of 1812 or some other iteration of that Constitution, not only would they introduce new regimes of property that were threatening to the Basque economy, not only would they break up the close relationship between church and state. But they were also afraid that they would exert greater centralized control from Madrid over these historically autonomous regions by introducing a form of administration that was essentially homogeneous across Spain's diverse jurisdictions. So it's not only a war in favor of a pretender to the Bourbon throne, it's not only a war in favor of Catholicism, it's also a war in favor of local autonomy from the Madrid regime. And Zumalacárregui is the leader who really effectively gets the Carlist War off to a start. And what he's so effective at is utilizing guerrilla tactics, which he had learned as a resistor to the French during the War of Independence earlier in the century. He uses those same tactics against Spanish armies, and eventually is so effective that he drives Madrid's armies from the region altogether, so that the Carlists find themselves, with the exception of the cities, so Bilbao, San Sebastian, Pamplona, remain liberal bastions, but the countryside and the smaller towns are completely in the hands of the Carlists. And it takes years, including several years after his own death in battle, for the Madrid regime to finally force the Carlists to the bargaining table in 1840 and to give up their claims to the Spanish throne, although they never completely renounced them. So, the liberals ultimately are triumphant. They establish constitutional monarchy on a firm footing. They revise the 1812 Constitution, so it's much more conservative, much more oligarchical, less democratic. But they do carry out many of the economic and legal reforms that the Carlists had been so afraid of. In particular, what they do is the key reform of the 1830s that really transforms the Spanish economy are a whole series of disentailments of property within Spain. So ecclesiastical property, aristocratic property, communally held peasant properties all around the peninsula are broken up, put on the market, and sold to private investors. So one of the revolutionary aspects of the 1830s is precisely this massive transfer of landed wealth away from religious and aristocratic notables and toward private individuals. So this sets the stage for a period under Isabella's rule of quite significant economic modernization, right? So the principles of private property are introduced, feudal wealth is broken up. There is progress towards agricultural improvement, although it doesn't really hit its full stride until several decades later. Spain still has subsistence crises up until the 1860s. This period also sees the beginnings of industrialization in Barcelona in particular in the 1830s and the 1840s. This is an image of a factory from Barcelona that specialized in a kind of textile called indianas, which were stamped, highly decorative textiles that were produced there. They found a good market in Spain, mostly because the government was highly protectionist of native industries. So Catalonia was always a region that was highly invested in liberalism, but also highly invested in protectionist economic policies to protect its nascent industrial economy particularly against British competition. The railway, also the national railway, which is seen as a key aspect of economic modernization, gets underway in the 1840s as well. first in Catalonia. But throughout the 1850s and 1860s, there's a quite rapid spread of the railway network, funded largely by French capital, and French engineers are quite prominent in Spain during this period also. And the idea is that the railway will create a national market. Right? Spain is a country that is physically, geographically quite fragmented, very difficult to create a domestic market for goods from places like Catalonia or agricultural goods from Andalusia or Valencia. So the hope is that improved roads and in particular a railway network will set the stage for that sort of national market, which will be the foundation of economic modernization. So this is a period of some significant economic growth and change under Isabella. This interesting image as well of Isabella with the consort, the Duke of Cadiz, and their son, Alfonso XII, who would become king in 1875. This image was meant to show that she was sort of the mother of the Spanish people. These other images, however, show that sentiment ultimately turned against her. Right? Carne, flesh is the subtitle of this one, these very harsh caricatures. This is actually a year after she'd been driven into exile. But the reason why she had become so unpopular to many sectors of the Spanish political class is that even though there is the successful creation of a constitutional monarchy under her guidance in in her name in the 1830s, it's still those who are loyal to the Constitution are very divided among themselves. So some of them, on the one hand, there's a party called the moderates, and on the other hand, there's a party called the progressives. And the moderates are really interested in economic modernization, but they have absolutely no interest in political democracy. So they tend to rule in combination with the monarchy, always tending towards dictatorship, essentially. And the only way the progressives, who are much more inclined towards political democracy, the only way they can get into power is by staging pronunciamientos. Right? So the whole period of Isabella's reign, even though it's a period of constitutional governance and economic growth, is still politically extremely unstable because of this inability of the progressives and the moderates to make peace between themselves or with the monarchy, for that matter. So Spain, even though it is constitutional, is very bitterly divided and politically unstable during this period. And Isabella is finally overthrown in 1868 and driven into exile, where she would spend the rest of her life, actually. And the leader of the Pronunciamiento that deposed her in 1868 and set up a regime, if you look at the outline again, in 1868, what's called the Democratic Revolution. The leader of this Pronunciamiento of 1868 is General Juan Primi Prats, who is a Catalan general. Very charismatic, interesting figure, has his finger in every pie in the middle of the 19th century, a real opportunist, but an effective one. So over the course of his career, he'd been the captain general, as I say, the governor of Puerto Rico, very politically sensitive, important position. He'd been a general in the War of Africa, which is depicted here by the great Spanish painter Fortuny. That was a very short-lived war between 1859 and 1860 between Spain and the Sultan of Morocco. And Prim and others had won numerous decorations and glories through their victories against the Sultan during the War of Africa. He had led a Spanish expedition to Mexico in the 1860s to recover debts. He had been an observer of the Crimean War in the 1850s, and after his expedition to Mexico, he'd been an observer of the U.S. Civil War as well. A big admirer. This is one of his missteps. He was actually a great admirer of George McClellan. So Prim is the leader, the caudillo of the Pronunciamiento of 1868, which chases the Bourbons into exile. Isabella II spends the rest of her life in Paris and sets up a new constitutional monarchy ruled by an Italian prince named Amadeus of Savoy. Extremely unstable regime because the revolutionaries are very divided among themselves. The only thing that had held them together was their hostility to the Bourbons, to Isabella II. Prim himself is assassinated in 1870. Nobody knows by whom, still to this day. Amadeo, without the protection of Prim, finally decides to abdicate in 1873. And for an 11-month period, Spain is governed by a republic, what's called the First Republic. That in turn is toppled in 1874. And the Bourbon monarchy is restored in 1875. The ruler is Alfonso XII, Isabella's son. And so this inaugurates a period that's known as the Restoration in Spanish history. But really, it's a period from 1875 effectively up until 1923, basically. We're not going to talk about the 20th century, but it's up until then, it was by far the most stable political regime in Spain's modern period. And part of the reason for that stability was because of the compromises designed by the real architect of the Restoration, Antonio Cánovas del Castillo, who authored the 1876 Constitution, which is the political document of the Restoration. But more importantly, what he did was to establish sort of coexistence among the different liberal factions and parties that had so constantly been at odds with one another since the 1830s. So in particular, he devises a system that's called the Torno Pacifico, the peaceful or the Pacific turn, which is to say that there's a tacit understanding that the two main parties, the conservatives and the liberals, rather than having to effect political change through a pronunciamiento, will agree when it's time for the other party to take power. Right? So they stage elections, and in any case, the party that's chosen or pre-chosen to govern would return something like 80 or 90% of the deputies to the parliament. So this is a form of power sharing that stabilizes Spanish politics for several decades. It's so effective that it even withstands the introduction of political, let's say, male universal political rights in 1890. And the reason is because of the phenomenon that in Spanish is called caciquismo, right? And what that refers to is the cacique, the political boss. The political boss is a local notable, perhaps, or a local enforcer of some kind who organizes political support on the local level and acts as a mediator between Madrid and the provinces, effectively. So orchestrates the electoral results that Madrid expects during the Pacific turn, essentially. So the way this operation typically worked is that the key office here was what was called the Ministry of Governance. Most European countries now would call that office the Interior Ministry, a sort of home office in charge of internal security. And so the Ministry of Governance would oversee these rigged elections, essentially, so that the conservatives would rule for 4 or 5 years, when some sort of impasse was reached, a deal would be worked out with the opposition liberals, and they in turn would be voted overwhelmingly into office. So, as I say, this stabilized the political regime for several decades. It also got the military out of politics, at least for a few decades. And to a certain degree, it also neutralized the throne, right? Because that had been one of the destabilizing elements under Isabella II, was her refusal to work with the progressives and only with the moderates. And so this system devised by Cánovas neutralizes that, at least temporarily, that personalism of the Spanish throne. So, in addition to political stability, this is a period of pretty significant economic growth in Spain also. These are a couple of images that highlight aspects of it. This is the Crystal Palace in Retiro Park that was built in 1887 for a Philippines exhibit. This was important because the Spanish economy was much more closely tied into the Asian market after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. So Catalunya, Barcelona in particular, became the major port of trade between Spain and the Philippines during the Restoration. And so this exhibit was organized to help foment trade and interest in those distant Asian colonies. This is the Atocha train station, which is still there to this day in Madrid in 1892. Also a big year of celebrations, the 400th anniversary of Columbus's first voyage, there were huge festivities in Madrid and all throughout the peninsula to mark the 400th anniversary. But even though there's this period of, political peace, some economic growth, cultural complacency of some kind, some cultural flourishing as well. This is a great period of Spanish novels in particular. There's also a lot of trouble under the surface, not just in Spain, but also in the colonies as well. This image shows one of the sources of trouble, which is the United States. By the 1890s, Cuba, which is still the world's biggest producer of cane sugar, is exporting over 90% of its crop to the United States. Right? Spain is a tiny market for Cuban sugar. So Cuba is really moving into the economic orbit of the United States in the second half of the 19th century. And that really destabilizes Spanish rule in the colony. Even though it's a period of real expansion of Cuban sugar, Puerto Rican coffee, various kinds of tropical commodities in the Philippines as well, is also an interesting period of Spanish migration as well. It's a huge, beginning from in about 1880, this inaugurates a huge period of Spanish migration to the Americas, not so much to the United States, but to Cuba, to Mexico, Brazil, Uruguay, and above all to Argentina, right? So it's a huge wave of immigration to some colonies, to some independent countries. Very important for the metropolitan economy as well, because the remittances of those immigrants is an important source of wealth and growth back in Europe. So in any case, this unstable relationship, however, this triangle of Spain, Cuba, and the United States is very unstable. And eventually it breaks out into open warfare in Cuba in 1895. There's a deeper history here, and if you'd like me to go into it, I can talk a little bit about it in the questions afterwards. But what leads Spain and the U.S. immediately into conflict is the outbreak of a war of independence in Cuba in 1895. Led at the beginning, until he's killed in battle, by the famous poet José Martí, but then led by a series of military men, including Antonio Maceo. And what Maceo was able to carry out was this very important invasion from the eastern provinces, Oriente, the eastern provinces of Cuba, where rebellions had taken hold in the latter part of the 19th century. But what he's able to do is he's able to break through into the west. And what's important about this is that in the center and western part of the island, that's where the vast bulk of the population is. That's where the vast bulk of the sugar plantations, the railways, and so on. Right? So he's able to take his forces into these western regions and carry out this war of economic attrition or destruction. Right? So wherever his troops travel in the west, they burn down plantations, they set fire to sugarcane fields, they tear up railway tracks. It's basically a form of economic warfare to separate the wealthy West away from its loyalty to Spain. Other wars of independence in Cuba had completely failed to touch this massive population and economic strength in the West. So Maceo's breakthrough into the West sounds real alarm bells back in Madrid. And so the response is to send, to replace the commander of Spanish forces in Cuba. The commander at the time of the outbreak of the war was persuaded that negotiation and conciliation could win the Cubans over, essentially. But that's not going to be the case, right? Is that Maceo and others are there to fight to the bitter end, and they're using these tactics. So the way the Spaniards respond under Cánovas is to send General Valeriano Weyler, known as a very hard man in colonial matters. He'd served in Cuba before. He was the Captain General of the Philippines as well. He is sent to Cuba, and he introduces a policy that's called reconcentración, in which his idea is that since the Cubans are fighting a guerrilla warfare, they're living off the land, they're gathering intelligence and resources, manpower from the local population, he decides to cut them off from that. And the way he does that is by putting the rural population into concentration camps. Right? So the idea is that he's going to empty out the countryside. The Cuban guerrillas will be isolated in terms of resources and intelligence, and his own flying battalions will be able to pick them off more effectively. Historians have estimated that some 10% of the pre-war Cuban population dies in the camps from starvation and epidemic diseases. And it's Weyler and this policy that attract the attention and the outrage of the American public, right? So the Americans have had a long-standing interest in Cuba, really since American independence. The idea was that among many American leaders, was that if somehow Spanish sovereignty were to come to an end in Cuba, then the result must be that Cuba would become part of the United States. And so there's a deep interest in Cuba. There's a hostility to Spanish colonialism in Cuba, but there's also hostility towards the idea of Cuban independence and sovereignty. And so the war that breaks out in 1895, the violent counterinsurgency carried out by Weyler attracts a lot of American attention, and eventually leads to the outbreak of war between between Spain and the United States. And the real trigger, as everyone knows, of course, is the explosion of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898. Right, and so the conviction among American politicians and military leaders and public opinion is that the Spaniards had mined the Maine and blown it up. The Spaniards thought that the Cubans had done it to provoke the American entry into the war. But what turns out what really happened, which was not really confirmed until several decades later, was that there was an internal explosion within the Maine, which led to its destruction. So the war, as we know, is very short-lived. The Americans destroyed the Spanish fleet in the Pacific at Manila, and then a couple of months later they destroyed the Spanish Atlantic fleet at Santiago de Cuba. They land troops in the Philippines, they land troops in Cuba, they land troops in Puerto Rico as well, and Spain quickly sues for peace. And the peace treaty of 1898, the Treaty of Paris, brings Spanish rule in those places to an end. The U.S. annexes Puerto Rico and the Philippines, as well as some other Pacific islands, and it sets up a sort of protectorate in Cuba, even though it does not annex Cuba. So for Spain, the war is obviously devastating. This is an image of Spanish troops being repatriated in the summer of 1898. Over 50,000 Spanish soldiers died in Cuba between 1895 and 1898. And they didn't die in combat. They died of yellow fever, of malaria, of cholera, of diseases, primarily. So the conduct of the war is a real blow to the legitimacy of the restoration regime that had been set up by Cánovas, right? Because it shows that it's completely incapable of keeping pace with its international rivals, and that it's taking this terrible toll upon the popular classes in Spain. So there's a lot of resistance to military service. There's a lot of draft dodging that takes place during the Cuban War, and there's a horrible price paid by the men who are drafted into the army and who serve in Cuba. All right, I think I'll wrap up here, so there's a little time for questions. Just a couple of concluding remarks. If we look over the 19th century, constitutional monarchy is solidified and absolutism is vanquished in Spain. Democracy is introduced in 1890. Male suffrage is instituted in 1890. There's modest but sustained economic growth and modernization in all sectors of the economy. And even in 1898, the evacuation of Spaniards from Cuba leads to this important repatriation of capital to the peninsula. So the early 20th century actually sees a significant economic boom as an unintended consequence of military disaster. On the other hand, caciquismo, that is, political bossism, is the condition of constitutional monarchy. There's growing popular discontent because of the war. Economic progress is regionally uneven. And even in those regions that are most developed, like Catalonia, the incidence of class conflict is extremely intense by the end of the 19th century. Spain has shown itself incapable of waging industrialized warfare. That's one of the lessons of the War of 1898. It's not expanding its empire is contracting in an age of empires. Finally, the War of 1898 galvanizes regional nationalisms. This is really when Catalan and Basque nationalisms become potent political forces in Spain, because the Madrid regime has shown itself, in their eyes, incapable of furthering and protecting their interests. All right, thank you.
So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you. We ask that those of you that are leaving now, please do so quietly.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. Could you tell me whether Bombay falls into this Asian expansion in this period of time?
I'm sorry, whether what falls into?
Bombay.
Bombay.
Mumbai, but Bombay.
Certainly not in the Spanish orbit. No. I mean, it's an important center of British imperialism, most definitely. But the Spanish in Asia are limited really to the Philippines, although they do take part in a joint invasion of Vietnam with the French in the 1850s and the 1860s.
Could you talk a little bit about the use of the words liberal and guerrilla in terms of the 19th century in Spain?
Yeah, liberal in 19th century Spain would refer to those advocates of constitutional governance, right, in particular. So the term liberal is actually invented in Cádiz during the resistance to the French, because the drafters, the framers of the Spanish Constitution of 1812 identified themselves as liberals, liberales. So liberalism in Spain is associated very much with constitutional governance. And it also has the connotation as well of economic liberalism as well. So free trade, free labor, market economies as well. Guerrilla, the Little War, that's what it means literally in Spanish, the Little War, is a reference to informal warfare, partisans, essentially. Local resistors to foreign occupation who are really able to resist very effectively because of their knowledge of the local landscape, their ability to gather intelligence, and also their ability to live effectively off of the land because of their integration into local networks.
You mentioned Catalonia and the Basque territories as areas of regionalism. Is there any degree of rampant liberalism and nationalism within the other provinces, or provincialism, some structure, organism that Andalusia? Or?
Right. Yeah, well, I would say in the 19th century, so the period that we've talked about today, for the most part, I think that there's a commitment to a Spanish nation in most parts of Spain. There's the idea that a sort of Spanish nation that encompasses regional differences and peculiarities, that would be the outcome of a constitutional government and a modern economy. So, and that finds a warm reception in Catalonia, in the Basque Country, really in all the major centers of the Iberian Peninsula. When this begins to go sour is really around the Restoration, around the issues of political corruption, the caciquismo. So local interests feel like they can't really get their voices heard in Madrid. Right? So Barcelona feels that it's cut off from effective self-governance by the political corruption at the center. And then also, as I said, the War of 1898 is very galvanizing too, because the Catalans, for example, are very much implicated in the colonies in the 19th century. Right? The Philippines, but also the Antilles, are very important markets for their goods. In Cuba in the early 19th century, the big slave trading faction is called the Partido Catalán, the Catalan Party, because there's so many merchants from Catalunya who take part not just in slaving, but also in banking and commerce and so on. Right? So the fact that this, very lucrative, small but lucrative colonial empire suddenly goes up in dust, it really galvanizes opinion in Catalonia to say that we can no longer allow our economic fortunes to be dictated from by this incompetent government in Madrid. So they're not really opting for separation from Spain, but what they're opting for is a greater voice in the governance of the entire country. So that Spain will be led from Catalonia, not from Madrid.
Could you explain why the war was so one-sided, the War of 1898?
In particular, I guess the key is really the ability of the American Navy to build a modern force of steam-powered battleships, which are able to basically pummel and destroy the Spanish fleet without the Spaniards in turn being able to respond effectively. So Spain had been modernizing its navy in the second half of the 19th century, and it did have some, a significant number of steam-driven battleships, but they were much inferior to the Americans or the British or the Germans. They simply couldn't compete, and so they were outgunned at sea. And once their naval fleets were destroyed, the peninsula was effectively exposed. So there's a lot of concern about not just a North American invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, but that, maybe the Germans will decide they want the Canary Islands, or maybe the British will want the Balearics, right? So.
Do the regions today in Spain interpret this history differently in the same way that in this country, for instance, our sections interpret the Civil War differently? They find different heroes and different points of the exercise?
Yeah, no, that's a very good comparison. Yes, absolutely. In fact, there was huge controversy in Spain over the past year because, especially among historians, because a group of historians, some of whom are quite notable, organized a conference in Barcelona that was called España contra Catalunya, Spain against Catalunya. And so it's a way of reinterpreting Spanish and Catalan history as, Catalunya being this perpetual victim of Spain, of Madrid, of Castile, and so on. So yes, there's that. That's a very radical view. However, that's a minority view, not a majority view by any means. But it's politically contingent in a sense, and I would say that these perspectives have become really quite radicalized in recent years by the economic crisis. And, some of the regions right now are thinking that they might be better off either cutting a more favorable deal with Madrid in terms of, local economic and budgetary autonomy, or by even going their separate ways, particularly these more prosperous regions like Catalunya and the Basque Country. Basque Country already does have a lot of budgetary autonomy, and that's what the Catalans want also. But this crisis has really exacerbated those tensions and tends to radicalize these readings of history. Also, this is another important factor too, is that Spain's constitutional regime that was restored after the death of Franco in the 1970s, it's a relatively decentralized political structure. And so what it's done is to set up all these autonomous communities around Spain. So Catalunya, País Vasco, Castile-León, and so on. Each of them has their own form of their own local governments, and these have become huge sources of patronage for local histories. So one of the byproducts of the transition to democracy has been this explosion of local regional histories of Spain. So it's hard to write a history of Spain now. It's more about regions.
During the 1830s, when land ownership changed, how would this have affected the common man on the land? Because mostly, I am assuming that the majority of people able to buy land would be the elite nobility. So possibly the changes weren't too substantial for most people.
Yeah, well, it wasn't just the nobility, but you're quite right, is that the wealthy were obviously able to take advantage of this opportunity, with the inside political connections or available capital to buy large chunks of lands. So, yeah, I think the idea is that what emerges is an oligarchy rather than a democracy, right? So that land becomes, there is a massive transfer of wealth. There's no doubt about that. It's a revolution in the 1830s, right? The church is completely dispossessed as a wealth holder in the 1830s. Many of the aristocratic lands are transferred to private owners, and many of the communal lands are as well. But what emerges is a new class of wealthy landed elites, right? So it's a conservative bourgeoisie, essentially, is what emerges from the changes of the 1830s. And many peasants are pushed off the lands. And that's, in a sense, that's what the Carlists are fighting against, right? Not so much Don Carlos himself, but his popular supporters in regions like the Basque Country, is that they don't want that regime of property introduced into their territories and breaking up their communal forms of cultivation.
Last question over there.
I'm wondering if you can give a couple bullets of art or architecture interests in addition to the political things. What I thought of, and it's not exactly at the right time, but I thought of Gaudi right around the time of the Spanish-American War. Was building an apartment house
Yeah.
in Spain and had to change the design of it to make it look less religious or less Catholic or something, because at the same time, I believe hundreds of church-owned buildings were being blown up by the locals. And I'm wondering either that or painting and so forth during some of your political things, if we can relate them. I know it's kind of late to do that.
Yeah, Gaudi and Catalunya, Barcelona are very interesting in this regard, of course, right? Because, Gaudi was a conservative Catholic. His big monument is the Sagrada Familia, the unfinished Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona. His patrons, were the great Barcelona bourgeois, Casa Batlló, which is one of his famous monuments. The Batllós were important industrialists in mid-19th century Barcelona, so owners of factories and investors in railways and so on. So Gaudi is very hooked into this conservative Catholic elite, which is very, economically extremely advanced and dynamic in Barcelona in the 19th century. At the same time, as I said, right at the very end, is that Barcelona is a site of very intense class conflict because of industrialization. It has the most active working class in the country in the 19th century. And one element of class conflict in Spain is anti-clericalism. So in moments of political crisis, including in the 1830s actually, one of the ways in which these tensions manifest themselves is through assaults on ecclesiastical buildings and religious personnel, right? So the 19th and 20th centuries are punctuated by massacres of priests and nuns and the destruction of churches, convents, monasteries, and so on. And Barcelona is ground zero for those kinds of conflicts.
Thank you very much for coming.